When I was a kid, I attended a small private Christian school. We had about 25 students in each grade, and this was a special school. It was kind of a ministry where they paid the teachers practically nothing, and families could pay what they could afford. And that's the only reason my family was able to attend this school. And for the most part, it was a great place for me to kind of get this foundation of faith and kind of a safe place to grow as a kid. I went there from kindergarten to 5th grade, and for reasons beyond my 10-year-old mind could comprehend, before 6th grade, the school closed down, and I was then sent off to go to our local public school. It took me a long time to really transition. I think it wasn't even until I was about 10th grade I really found my place in school. But as you can imagine, junior high was a pretty awkward place, pretty difficult. I was a chubby, insecure, quiet little kid. Most of the days I sat alone at the lunch table, trying to avoid other people. And being the 80s, there wasn't much sensitivity training for our kids those days, right? And so I was an easy target for bullies. And one of the things that didn't really help was my taste in music. While most around me were jamming to people like George Michael or Whitney Houston or Guns N' Roses or Poison or any of those great 80s bands, I was a fan of Christian music. That contemporary Christian music from Amy Grant to Micah W. Smith to Stephen Curtis Chapman, if anybody is familiar with that. Then there was those harder, rocky groups like White Heart or Mylon Lefebvre or Petra. Most of you probably never heard of any of these people. But my family and I, we were mostly listening to Christian music, and so that was really what we would listen to. And during that time, during the late 80s, there was a musical trio that emerged out of Liberty University. They were called DC Talk. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of them. DC Talk. It was my first foray into Christian rap, or rap of any kind. And their first hit was a song called Heaven Bound. Heaven Bound. It was so awesome for a bunch of us dorky kids. And that summer, before I'm probably 7th or 8th grade, I got to see DC Talk perform at a Christian music festival that our family attended for our summer vacations. And while I was there, I made the best purchase ever. This cool shirt. I mean, this was an awesome shirt. I was so excited to don the shirt and walk through school and be like, yeah, DC Talk, man, words. Unfortunately, this became additional ammunition for people to ridicule me and mock me and say, oh, that Christian music kid. So what I thought would be a cool factor turned out to be an uncool factor. And this shirt quickly disappeared from my collection, unfortunately. I'd wear that today, I'll say though. But blessed are the persecuted. Today we come to Jesus' last beatitude. Over the past 2 months or so, we've discussed these statements that Jesus gave at the beginning of his Sermon on the Mount to help us understand what happiness is. And he takes the idea of us understanding happiness based on what's happening in our worlds around us. He flips it on its head and says it's not about what's happening to you, but really about your relationship with God and with others. And so as we come to the close of the series and we come to this beatitude, we find it's really probably maybe the most difficult to embrace. Blessed are the persecuted. Right? Jesus says, you are blessed when they insult you and persecute you. You are blessed when they falsely say all kinds of evil against you. You're to be glad and rejoice. Now, I think there's a typo in there, right? I mean, that doesn't seem right? Can Jesus really mean that if you're abused and mistreated, you can be blessed and happy? Does this happiness of God really come when you're being persecuted or people are making these accusations against you? I mean, these other beatitudes that we've looked at in these past few weeks, they've been difficult, but this one seems downright impossible. It's hard to imagine that Jesus really meant this one. Right? Be glad, rejoice. You've got to be kidding me, Jesus, right? So here we go. Today and this week, as you go through small groups, our task is to wrestle with what Jesus means when he says that the persecuted are blessed. And so I want to propose, this is kind of the essence of the message this morning, that here it is that there are always consequences for doing right and following Jesus. But when we accept these consequences, we experience the blessedness of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. Let that sink in for you, and we'll go back to that. But I want to start us off with this question to wrestle with. Are we persecuted? Are we persecuted? Now, there are Christians all over the world who face harsh persecution. People who risk their lives for the gospel. There are places all over the world where Christianity is illegal, and if you confess to being a Christian, you're taken away, your government will arrest you, put you in jail, you may be abused and tortured or excommunicated from your friends and your family. There are villages in Africa here that are being burned to the ground because the village confesses Christ. There are Christians who are imprisoned and tortured. They experience loss of property. They're discriminated against. Following Jesus to a lot of people around our world may cost them their lives or risk the lives of people they love. Persecution is real. It's prevalent all over the globe. Millions of believers face the deep ramifications of their faith. This week, I want to challenge you to check out two websites. Very similar. One is for an organization called Voice of the Martyrs. Another is the International Christian Concern. Pretty easy to remember. One is persecution.com. The other is persecution.org. And they tell stories of people who face persecution in their country, in their lives. You can sign up for their prayer calendars, pray for these people who are struggling, and find ways to support them. I want to ask us the question, back to here. Are we persecuted? Are we here, people here in Buxton, Maine, are we persecuted? Now, we can all agree that culture has shifted. We've gone from modern to postmodern to post-postmodern, which none of us really makes sense. We've gone from a relatively Christian culture to a post-Christian culture, and some would suggest we've gone all the way back to a pre-Christian culture. But in that shift, as the political powers have shifted, and maybe the evangelical church had some political power once, that seems to be slipping away. And the cultural morals and ideals of our world have changed. But are we persecuted? What does it mean that we are persecuted? Because the political powers are maybe different than you support, you agree with, that does not mean that you're being persecuted. Because the cultural morality may not be where it used to be, where things that used to be once black and white have now become 50 shades of gray, and you're like, what's going on? That doesn't mean that you're persecuted. Because displays of the Ten Commandments may be removed from places like government buildings does not mean that you're persecuted. In fact, interesting thing I saw this week was that someone talking about how people get up in arms about the Ten Commandments being removed, but why don't we have plaques like of the beatitudes posted? Isn't that even more important to be displayed? Because that's teachings that Jesus gave us. Going back, just because there's no teacher-led prayer at the start of school, does not mean that we're being persecuted. Just because the abortion laws are changing and weird and continually seems to be in flux right now, that does not mean that we're being persecuted. Because the country's cultural definition of what marriage is has changed doesn't mean that we're being persecuted, or just because people who identify as LGBTQ plus have this louder voice or being able to express themselves more freely does not mean that you're being persecuted. Because there's an increase of all other faiths in our world, in our community around us, that there are Jewish and Muslim and Hindu and Wiccan and spiritual and agnostic and atheist people all around us, that does not mean that we're being persecuted. What that means is that you are called to be a faithful and true witness for Jesus in our ever-changing culture. So back to the question, are we persecuted? If we try to answer ourselves, what is Jesus getting at? What does he mean by being persecuted? And why should someone be persecuted? Why should someone be blessed when they're persecuted? We have to go back to what he says. He says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. So for Jesus, there are two reasons why someone would face this blessed persecution. It's doing what is right and following Jesus. We're not facing persecution when we wear a DC Talk shirt to our junior high school and get made fun of. We're not facing it when we like certain music and people don't, when we have a different political opinion than other people, when we practice a different lifestyle, when they practice a different lifestyle that we disagree with. The laws might be changing. This is not the blessed persecution that Jesus is talking about. Darrell Johnson, he writes this: Jesus is not blessing those who get persecuted for being obnoxious, or those who get persecuted for being tactless, or those who are culturally insensitive as they bear witness in our world. Jesus is not congratulating those who are persecuted for being dogmatically dogmatic or narrow-mindedly narrow-minded. Jesus is not applauding the thrill-seeking confrontationist or the person with a victim complex. Jesus is blessing those who find themselves in trouble because of righteousness and because of him. So if you're out there being obnoxious about your faith, you're getting up on a soapbox and yelling, "Turn or burn," right? And people start making fun of you, that's not the type of persecution Jesus is talking about. If you're trying to force your beliefs on other people who disagree with you and they oppose you, that's not the persecution Jesus is talking about. If you're not respecting other people's beliefs and ideals and you get called out on that, that's not the type of persecution Jesus is talking about. And if you're prejudiced against a person based on race or gender or religion or sexual practice, and they reject you for that, that's not the type of persecution Jesus is talking about. We who are followers of Jesus are not called to be the cultural watchdogs and the morality police. We are called to exhibit the love of Jesus to those around us. You got to remember what Jesus did. Jesus went and he touched the lepers. He ate with the sinners and the tax collectors. He forgave the adulterous woman. He sent the Samaritan woman to be his first missionary. He healed the lame. He gave sight to the blind. He told Peter, who denied him, to feed his sheep. Jesus came to restore people into a right relationship with God. He didn't do it by berating sinners. He did it by showing them that God loved them and valued them. In fact, when we think about the people who persecuted Jesus, who were they? They were the religious leaders and the political leaders. These were the people who had something to lose with Jesus there. They had to lose their power. And in striving to hold on to their power, they began to bend and break and reshape rules to fit their own plans. They stepped away from doing what is right and caring for others, They began to do what they needed to do to hold on to something they never really had. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me." So is Jesus saying that if we're not facing persecution, if we're not being insulted, or we're not being accused falsely of things, that we're not doing things right? That if we're not following him, that we're not really blessed? Is he saying that the only mark of a true disciple is someone who's constantly being insulted and abused? I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at. I hope not. But just because I don't think that the absence of persecution necessarily coincides with someone who's unrighteous or not following Jesus. But we should think about that. Consider, if we're not facing opposition, why not? What are we doing, or what are we not doing to avoid persecution? As I said earlier, that there are always consequences for doing right and following Jesus. Jesus came, he came to establish the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And when the kingdom of heaven comes to earth and it clashes with the kingdom of this world, and when these two kingdoms are clashing, there's going to be friction. There's going to be opposition. When we choose to follow the way of Jesus, we choose to do what is right, undoubtedly we will face consequences. And there are times in our lives where we have to face the choice of doing what is right and doing what is maybe culturally expected of us, or doing what people want us to do. We find ourselves in these situations, we are given that choice. And as Jesus tells us, we need to count the cost. We need to figure out if that's what we want to do. Jesus often talked about counting the cost. In fact, he shared lots of different stories about that. And one of them is about this king. He says there's a king who was going to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and decide if he's able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If not, while the other is still far off, he'll send a delegation and ask for terms of peace. So here's a king that has to count the cost, decide if he wants war or if he wants peace. And what's the consequence of war versus the consequence of peace? Is the thrill of the battle worth the casualty of his people? Is his ego overinflated, thinking that his smaller army could take this larger opposing army? And that would then secure his name as a famed military leader that will go down in the history books. Or will seeking peace preserve his people, and maybe he might lose some sort of notoriety, but his land will be saved and his people will live in peace? The king has to look out, not for his own interests, not for his own desires, but the interests and desires and needs of his people. Jesus is saying that there are consequences. There are consequences for doing right and following him. And like the king, we need to count the cost. We need to make that choice, decide whether that choice is worth it, to see whether we're to seek our own self-interest or follow the leading of Jesus. As you know, I love movies, and as I was thinking about it, what great movie, Remember the Titans. Has anyone seen that movie? So, I see something that's good. So, the school is being integrated, this white high school in Virginia is being integrated, and black students are coming in. And as you can imagine, the racial tension is thick. The community as a whole is on edge, and the school is a tinderbox waiting to go off. And this film centers around the football team. Black students are coming in and taking the spots of white students, and it's causing a lot of conflict in there. Right? And then there's the team captain. His name is Jerry, and he has to figure out whether he's going to help bring in these new black students or stand up for his former group of friends. And he has to count the cost, whether he should follow his own prejudice and bigotry or do what is right. And he decides to help the team integrate so they can go and just be a more effective team. But there are the consequences. Some of his friends turn against him, some people in the community turn against him, and his girlfriend dumps him. Because there are always consequences. There are always consequences for doing right and following Jesus. But when we accept those consequences, we experience the blessedness of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. 2,000 years ago, over 5,000 miles away, Jesus got up and delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And he started with these statements of blessings, one on top of the other, one building on the other. These proclamations then build and build and build till we get to this climax. Blessed are the persecuted. Rejoice, be glad. You've got to be kidding me. This beatitude-filled life, it builds on each other. As we said, these beatitudes are not describing 8 different followers of Jesus, where you can be pure in heart and I will be the peacemaker, but they are 8 qualities that every follower of Jesus should have if they want to have a beatitude life. We don't get to pick and choose, right? But we get this kind of build on top of the other. So we start out as poor in spirit. And we make our way to being persecuted. But along the way, we discover how to mourn, how to be meek, how to hunger and thirst for what is right, how to be merciful, how to be pure in heart, and how to be peacemakers. And each step along the way, we come face to face with consequences for seeking God's blessedness as opposed to the world's happiness. The poor in spirit face the consequences of understanding their own sinfulness and spiritual poverty, knowing that they cannot make it through life on their own. Those who mourn face the consequence that they can no longer just simply wallow in their own sorrow, but take that comfort that they receive from God and share it with others. Those who are meek face the consequences of their own humility, not striving to get ahead in the rat race, but working to lift others up, to bring equality and understanding in our world. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness face the consequences of having to feed that hunger and recognizing that there's unrighteousness in our world and doing what it takes to bring God's righteousness in this world, to do what is right and true. And those who are merciful face the consequence of extending mercy to others, to offering God's mercy and forgiveness that He has poured out to us on others, even to people that we don't think deserve it. Those who are pure in heart face the consequence of having their hearts broken for what breaks God. As we look around, we strive for our own happily ever after, but the pure in heart, they are striving to have the heart of God, to see the face of God in our world. Those who are peacemakers have the consequence of striving to make peace instead of keeping the peace, to stop masking the problems, but work to solve problems, to stop looking out for themselves, but to look out for others, to stop seeking our own happiness, but looking for the blessedness of God in our world. But wait, there's more. Jesus, in this beatitude, He makes a promise. He tells us the beautiful thing as we go through this, we talk about being persecuted. He says that we are not alone. That those who face the consequences of doing right and following Jesus have a powerful support system. He says, Be glad, rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven. That's how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You're going to face unforeseen obstacles, challenges, and consequences if you choose to live a beatitude life. But the good news is you're not alone. You are in good company. Jesus says they persecuted the prophets. They persecuted Jesus, and we see that in the early church. The disciples were all persecuted, and most of them were killed for their faith. Only one stayed alive. They were all martyred. You're going to face hard times and persecution and the consequences of a faith, but don't worry. You are not alone. The author of Hebrews says that, therefore, since we have such a large cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that lies out before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. See, the whole chapter before the author writes this, they list a ton of people who followed Jesus faithfully and the consequences they faced for their choices. Hebrews 11 is called the chapter of faith, and it's a great hall of fame there. And these people, they become the cloud of witnesses in the arena of life that are cheering on the faithful followers to come. They're the ones that are cheering you and me on. They are encouraging us all to remain faithful and to endure. To keep our eyes on Jesus, they shall. Keep your eyes on him, and he will keep you from getting tripped up by your sin and your selfish way. The author of Hebrews continues, for the joy that lay before him, before Jesus, he endured the cross. He despised the shame and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners so that you won't grow weary and give up. We're encouraged to consider Jesus. Jesus is our prime example, a person who underwent ultimate persecution when he went to the cross. And he endured that cross for you and for me. He took on that shame of our sin and our separation from God. And he too was separated from the Father. And then they say, consider him so you won't grow weary and give up. There are always consequences for doing right and following Jesus. But when we accept these consequences, we experience the blessedness of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. The good thing is, not all consequences are bad. In this, we look back at these beatitudes, the first one and the last one start out the same. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. They have the same blessing. So, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Those who live a beatitude life are promised the kingdom of heaven, to be a part of the eternal throne room where Jesus sits next to the Heavenly Father. And when Jesus is pouring out, not wrath or judgment as we tend to think, but graciousness and compassion, and love and mercy. He's encouraging us to not be weary, not to give up, but to remain faithful in spite of any persecution or consequences we might face. See, the consequence of following Jesus and doing what is right might cause friction and turmoil in our mortal life. It may even cost you your very life. But there's a promise of an eternal reward, the kingdom of heaven, which we can experience here on earth today. Jesus invites you to experience his kingdom here on earth as a foretaste of that eternal kingdom of heaven. He calls us to a beatitude-filled life, filled with the consequences of sacrifice, but overflowing with blessedness and reward. And if you're willing to face these consequences, the beatitude of life, then you will be comforted. You'll experience a deep comfort from God. You will inherit the earth, resting on the assurance that God is in control. You will be filled, you will find satisfaction as being a part of God's love and justice in our world. You will discover mercy that wipes away your sins and leads you to show mercy to others. And you will see God. He will make himself clear to you in your life. You will be called Son of God. Or as we talked about, Derwin Gray talked about, you will exhibit the DNA of God in your life. You do that because the kingdom of heaven is yours. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad, rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven, for that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Amen.